Hello, so you've made it to week 5, and we're finally going to be done with To Kill a Mockingbird. So I think that that should make many of you quite happy. But this final unit or the final novel that we're going to be going over is sort of a culmination of everything that we have been working on this semester, and I guess in the entire sequence, kind of this year as a whole. Things that we've been looking at in 10th grade, it sort of has a world literature slash cultural literature topic. Um, when you move into 11th grade, you're going to be doing American literature. 12th grade is British literature. This is just kind of exposure to genres and different regions, as well as different cultural worldviews that are represented in the different pieces of literature. So if you think about Huckleberry Finn to Animal Farm and The Lord of the Flies, the Julius Caesar play, and some of, let's see, I think of Mice and Men. What else do we read? And then To Kill a Mockingbird. All of those deal with different cultural groups that have been oppressed or kind of the value of human life and dignity. And so we are going to continue with those themes as we look at this book. Things that we're going to be dealing with in particular with the book, which is called My Antonia, and it's written by Willa Cather. It was published in the early 1900s, and it's about the frontier period in American history, where sort of like the second expansion. So we'll be talking a little bit about the historical context in at the end of this or in the next video. But it's a coming of age story, and it kind of takes two veins. So in the same way that we had Scout and Jem looking at like the masculine and the feminine journey toward growth and maturity, this one is going to be looking at the narrative perspective, or from the narrative perspective of Jim, and he's a young man, to not Jem, but Jim, and the young woman that he kind of analyzes or discusses throughout, and her name is Antonia. And so we're going to be looking at the coming of age of both of them and how their experiences are different based upon their culture, their economic status, and that sort of thing. It's also a piece of feminist literature because we're going to see how the women were oppressed and did not have opportunities for making it in the world. And that'll make more sense because when you have to resort to things like, um, how do I want to say this? Like sexuality or unwholesome things to make money to help yourself to get on in the world, that's where feminist critics would kind of cry out and say that's wrong. And we're going to see that Jim didn't have that pressure, whereas Antonia did. Now, it is clean. There's nothing in the book that would elicit that sort of a response, but it's suggested and implied that women had a less than wholesome road if they wanted to launch out on their own and make something of themselves in many cases. So we're going to be looking at how it's unjust in that respect, the difference between the economic freedoms that men and women faced independently. We're going to be looking at the like family and culture and American identity. What does it mean to be American? There's going to be a conflict between religions. So we'll have like Catholic and Protestant conflicts, as well as kind of just a general worldview of rejecting all faith. And a kind of some of the literary features will be realism and descriptive language and sort of vivid imagery. So you can look for all of those things and anticipate those in the book. And they're all things that we've talked about this year as sort of a 10th grade class. So let's jump into some of the background, and then we'll look at some of the themes. So it again is called My Antonia, and it's by Willa Cather. And I'm going to link this text for you because it's a study text. It has supplemental resources for you to kind of understand and learn differently as you're reading through. So I wanted to do a little bit of the context of Cather's life and then the background of what was happening during this time. So Willa Cather was the oldest of 7 children. And she was born in 1873 in West Virginia, but when she was 10, her family moved to Nebraska and they lived in her grandparents' house. So a couple of things. When you're reading a text, it's really important to look at the author's biography because, one, if you are the oldest of seven children, you are going to be expected to have a lot of responsibility placed upon your shoulders. You will be the primary one that is responsible for taking care of the younger children, making sure you carry the brunt of the chores, that you help your parent. And so we're going to see these ideals that arise in the book of hard work, of kind of like drive toward making something of yourself. And we're going to see a lot of Cather herself in the character of Antonia. And so it's a bit biographical in that sense. Secondly, it takes place in the location at the same time. So if you'll notice another similarity, Jim, our character, moves to Nebraska from the East when he was 10 years old. And so, again, that's another similarity. So, the landscape that she encountered there as a 10-year-old, with its miles of waving red grass, its few isolated trees, its openness to brutal weather, and its lonely settlers, permeated her imagination and became the source and setting for many of her most significant literary works. And so, her life is going to be very closely entwined with our narrator. So, um, that's a bit about who she is and that she lived this, and this is kind of her story. So, she was born in 1873, and here's just a timeline of her life. I wanted to point out that kind of so we can see when she began to publish. Her novel, so she wrote kind of all along when she was growing up, but she began to publish the first of her novels, O Pioneers, in 1913. And then in 1918, she published My Antonia. Let's also think about what was going on during this time. World War I was happening in the greater world, but Nebraska at the time was so removed from any of this, largely because when they were growing up, you're going to see a lot of a theme of isolation, loneliness, and being cut off from the world at large, that your world becomes the farm that you're living in. Your world becomes the small, intimate family unit that you have. And so that is very much going to shape her experience and the characters as well. So she lived until 1947, and she had a cerebral hemorrhage, and she lived in New York City, and she was 74 years old. So it was a pretty full life, and she was well known, and this is one of her most famous novels. So that's what we're going to read. All right, I want to switch over here for just a bit and give you a look at some pieces of historical context and literary context to help us kind of ground our understanding of the book. So, what makes a book a great work of literature? There are several elements. So, universal themes, that's something we've talked about throughout the entire year. It needs to be stylistically innovative. So, in other words, not just to copy or mimic what everyone else is doing, but it needs to be original and unique. It needs to sometimes challenge social norms and values and stand the test of time. So, we're going to, if you think back about each of the novels that we read, they all kind of follow this motif or this pattern. But I want to kind of give you a heads up with My Antonia. The universal themes that we're going to be looking at are struggle, and every human being can relate to struggle or challenge in some way. We're going to look at the prejudice that is applied to immigrants as a whole. So Antonia and her family are immigrants from the region of Bohemia. It doesn't give us a specific country location. It would be, but Bohemia is more of a region from the Eastern Bloc of Eastern Europe. And so if you think about it, we would tend to look at a person in our culture today and say, oh, they're Mexican. The problem is many immigrants that come to the United States are not necessarily from Mexico, even though they are from Latin American lineage or descent. And so it's a tendency that we have just to lump people together based upon their appearance, based upon their language, and say they are this and label them and ascribe an expectation to them when that's not necessarily true. So we'll be looking at a theme of immigrant prejudice. There are themes of the value of human life and what a person is worth. Everybody confronts that. And then another theme, like I said, coming of age and childhood that we can all relate to because everyone grows up. It is innovative for its time in its very descriptive tendencies in nature. So at one point, I'll be asking you to look up metaphors, similes, and personification, which is giving human-like traits to things that are not human. So animals or like the grass, things like that. So she was very innovative for her imagery and realism. And it's almost as if you can taste, smell, touch, experience the novel because of the language that she used. And it did challenge social norms. She challenges the public perception of immigrant culture. She challenges the public perception of what it means to be a man or to be a woman at this time. So, um, and it has stood the test of time because all of these things tell us about a very real period in American history that would be forgotten if literature had not preserved it. So it is doubtlessly an American classic. It is challenging, it has a challenging feminine lead who didn't reflect social norms at the time. It is universally appealing in its thematic nature, and it has an ability to withstand the test of time. We just talked about that. In the ways that it challenged social norms specifically, Antonia is portrayed as a strong, independent woman. She's a female character who helps support her family. That is not a common idea associated with women in literature up to that time. It also approached a topic that many skirted around, which is the struggle that immigrants had coming into America. So even though it was seen as the land of opportunity and the American dream was very much alive, it didn't end up being very dreamy for most people who came. And so there are consequences to being an immigrant that were skirted over oftentimes in political discourse or conversation. And some of the universal themes that I just discussed, mankind and the relationship with nature. So the Burdens and the Shimerdas and many other families on the Nebraska prairie had to survive the test of nature. And I have a question this week for you to answer is how is nature an actual character in this book it seems to have emotions and feelings. It seems to be alive and responsive and aggressive and all of the elements that a human being or a normal character would possess is sort of what nature becomes. And these families have to confront it. It represents the transition from childhood to adulthood. And then Jim and Antonia, the main characters, grow up and mature into adults through the trials and frustrations of life on the prairie. And they begin to realize aspects of childhood that don't carry on to adulthood. This contributes to a sense of nostalgia that is wrapped up in Jim and Antonia's memories. So one thing that literature preserves is that this time of life that you guys are living right now, 13 to about 18, it becomes something that people look back on with sort of a nostalgic longing. And so it becomes sort of this moment in time when people think like that's where I changed, that's where I grew, that's where I decided who I am. And so it preserves that thematic element. And it's an act of reading Cather is an act of discovering and imagining almost an endless number of ways in which memory inspires and terrifies, comforts and haunts, sustains and shocks, not simply individuals, but also communities, cultures, and nations. That's what one literary critic says. And it's so interesting to think about how our memories of certain events or certain people truly have power to shape our present reality and what we think. It's a way of storytelling and a glimpse of the past through the eyes of the modern time period. And so it appeals to people then and now. And so how did people feel about it when it was released? We'll go over this in the next video as well as a little bit more background information. So check back for that one.